I'm Susan, this is Hayley, and welcome to today's episode of Cancer Research Demystified. Today we're going to talk about the research around chemotherapy.
So your body's made up of cells. It's made up of about 37 trillion cells, and these cells are all different. One of the things that makes them different is how quickly or slowly they divide. Some cells will divide and get replaced really, really quickly, places that tend to get damaged more, so like places like your esophagus. And some cells will grow really slowly and aren't replaced very often, like brain cells. Cancer is a disease where cells grow and divide out of control. They keep replacing themselves and they keep growing. So chemotherapy is a range of drugs that is used for cancer. It's all different sorts of drugs, but they all do one thing in common, and they're designed to slow this growth, stop this division of cells.
Usually chemotherapy drugs don't specifically target cancer cells, but rather just any type of cell that's growing really quickly. And since these cancer cells are growing quicker than most other cells in the body, they're the ones that are most affected by the drug. And so what the drug does is stop the cell from growing and reproducing so that the cancer and the tumour itself is stopped.
So there are lots of cells in your healthy body that grow really quickly all the time. As we've said, maybe your esophagus, actually your hair, and also your bone marrow, and that's where your immune system comes from. So if you're taking a chemotherapy drug that's designed to attack these cells that grow quickly, these things are affected, and that can lead to those side effects you've probably heard of for chemotherapy. So hair loss, nausea, and actually a low, weak immune system. So different chemotherapies are different, and some of them have different side effect profiles, so it doesn't always happen with every chemo. So if you or a loved one are going through anything like that or have questions, always ask your medical team and they'll be able to talk you through all the side effect profiles.
Chemotherapy can be given in a number of different settings. So it can be given with curative intent, where you're hoping to cure the patient of their cancer, or with palliative intent, so that's more just to reduce symptoms. It can also be given at different stages within the disease, so we would refer to neoadjuvant chemotherapy as drugs that are given before a surgery, or adjuvant chemotherapy, so those are drugs that are given after the surgery.
So there's lots of different chemotherapy drugs and they all come from different places. So some of them come from plants, and paclitaxel comes from a plant, and some of them, like cisplatin, have tiny little molecules of metal in, like platinum. So the same metal that's in your engagement or wedding ring on a completely different molecular scale is found in chemotherapy drugs. So all these drugs also work in different ways. So the biochemistry of a cell, when it divides, there's lots of different places where you can stop that division. On the level of the DNA, you can break that up into bits. You can affect proteins that are in that cell that are absolutely required, you can stop them working, or you can just kind of mess around with the structure of the cell and stop it doing what it needs to do to divide.
So there's been research into chemotherapy drugs going on for decades and decades in terms of discovering new ones or different types and how they actually work. And actually some chemotherapy goes as far back as the Second World War and comes from things that were used in mustard gas back then.
So in cancer research today, one of the main topics is trying to understand how resistance to chemotherapy develops. So resistance to chemotherapy is when the drug doesn't work on someone's cancer, sometimes immediately, but sometimes it'll start working and then it'll stop working. And it's because those cells are changing and they're being able to not be sensitive to that drug anymore. And we want to know why.
So actually part of my own PhD was looking at resistance to chemotherapy, and I was actually looking at that platinum-based drug that we mentioned earlier called cisplatin in lung cancer. So I was trying to figure out why some patients' tumours kind of learn how to overcome treatment with cisplatin over time, gradually. And we actually figured out that there's a role of a gene called NF-kappa B that could be quite interesting in that setting. And we also looked at some drugs that could potentially be used in patients that are already resistant to cisplatin as well.
So one of the really hot topics in chemo resistance and why resistance develops is something called heterogeneity. And that means a mixture of all different things. And that's reflecting what we now know about cancer. It's actually a mixture of all different cells that are all very slightly different, and they continue changing over time. So what we think is happening is you start treating and it kills off most of the cells, but one or two of them, because they're ever so slightly different, are resistant. And it's these cells that then slowly take over and start to grow. So what we're trying to do as scientists is we're trying to stay one step ahead of that, to either predict which cells it's going to be, to change treatment regimes, to change schedules, to use drugs together in combination to try and stop that happening.
Okay folks, that's all for today. If you have any questions about chemotherapy research or research around resistance to chemotherapy, please pop them in the comments below. And other than that, it's goodbye from us.